December 19th, 1777. 12,000 ragged men trudged through frozen Pennsylvania mud, leaving trails of blood in the snow from their bare, bleeding feet. These were not defeated soldiers retreating in shame. These were George Washington's Continental Army, arriving at a place called Valley Forge, 20 miles from British-occupied Philadelphia, where they would face 6 months of frozen hell that would either destroy them completely or forge them into the army that would win American independence. The British Army, warm and well-fed in Philadelphia, expected these starving rebels to simply dissolve into the winter countryside, to abandon their impossible dream of freedom. Instead, something extraordinary happened in that frozen camp. Through starvation, disease, betrayal, and unimaginable suffering, Washington's army not only survived, they emerged as a disciplined fighting force that would shock the world. This is the true story of Valley Forge, where America's army was born in blood, ice, and an unbreakable will to be free. The Continental Army that marched into Valley Forge was an army in crisis. Just 3 months earlier, in September 1777, they had won a spectacular victory at Saratoga in New York, forcing an entire British army under General John Burgoyne to surrender. That victory would eventually bring France into the war as America's ally. But Washington's own campaign in Pennsylvania had been a disaster. He had lost the Battle of Brandywine in September, allowing British General William Howe to advance on Philadelphia. He had been defeated at Germantown in October, when a promising attack dissolved into chaos in heavy fog. Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital, had fallen to British control. The Continental Congress had fled to York. Pennsylvania, the revolution seemed to be collapsing. In the mid-Atlantic, even as it triumphed in the north, Washington's army was exhausted, demoralized, and running out of everything. They had no winter quarters prepared. They had no secure supply lines. They were outnumbered by a professional British army that now controlled the largest city in America. Washington faced an impossible decision about where to establish winter quarters. In 18th century warfare, armies typically stopped fighting during winter. The roads became impassable mud and ice. Gunpowder got wet. Soldiers froze. Both sides would retreat to comfortable quarters, rest, resupply, and wait for spring. The British had seized Philadelphia and settled in for a comfortable winter. Howe and his officers attended balls and theater performances. His troops occupied warm houses requisitioned from patriot families. They had plenty of food brought in by loyalist farmers. They controlled the Delaware River, giving them access to supply ships from Britain. Washington's options were far more limited. Some members of Congress wanted him to attempt a winter campaign to retake Philadelphia. This was military insanity. His troops lacked proper clothing. They were low on ammunition, and they could barely feed themselves. A winter offensive would have destroyed what remained of the Continental Army. Others suggested he disperse his forces into small detachments spread across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, letting the soldiers find shelter with sympathetic civilians. This would have solved the immediate supply crisis, but it would have left the army unable to respond if the British launched a surprise attack. Washington chose Valley Forge for several strategic reasons. It was close enough to Philadelphia, about 20 miles northwest, that his army could monitor British movements and prevent foraging parties from stripping the Pennsylvania countryside of food and supplies. It was far enough away that the British couldn't launch a surprise attack. Without Washington receiving warning, the location offered high ground that was defensible. It had access to the Schuylkill River for water. Though the river would freeze solid during the harsh winter, it had nearby forests that could provide timber for shelter and firewood. Most importantly, positioning his army between Philadelphia and York meant he was protecting the Continental Congress and the Pennsylvania state legislature while also protecting the agricultural regions to the west from British raids. The army that marched into Valley Forge on December 19th consisted of approximately 12,000 soldiers. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, and boys, some as young as 15 years old. They came from every colony. There were New Englanders who had been fighting since Lexington and Concord. There were Pennsylvanians defending their home state. There were Virginians and Marylanders. There were even small numbers of African Americans and Native Americans who had joined the Patriot cause. When they arrived at Valley Forge, there was nothing there. No barracks, no shelter, no supplies waiting for them. Just open fields and forest. Washington immediately issued orders for his men to build log huts, small cabins that would house 12 soldiers each. He specified the dimensions, 14 feet by 16 feet, with wooden doors and fireplaces. He offered a reward of $12 to the squad that built the best hut. The construction process was brutal. Men with axes, many of them poorly clothed and some barefoot, trudged into the frozen forests to cut timber. They dragged logs through snow and mud. They chinked the walls with clay to keep out the wind. The work went slowly because the men were already weak from hunger and exhaustion. Officers fared better. Higher-ranking officers spread out across the area, requisitioning local houses for their winter quarters. Washington himself moved into the Isaac Potts house, a stone dwelling that had been completed in 1770. It would serve as his headquarters throughout the encampment. But he made it clear that he would not move into the house until his troops had shelter. He stayed in his tent, enduring the same cold as his men, until enough huts were completed. The suffering began immediately. Washington described Valley Forge in a letter to Henry Laurens, President of the Continental Congress, as a place where his army faced potential dissolution. He wrote that unless something was done quickly, the army might simply cease to exist. The supply situation was catastrophic. The Continental Army's supply system had never worked properly, and by December 1777, it had essentially collapsed. The problem wasn't that supplies didn't exist. Pennsylvania's farms had produced food. Clothing and blankets existed in warehouses. The problem was getting those supplies to Valley Forge. The roads were nearly impassable. The army had no money to pay for supplies. Farmers were reluctant to accept Continental currency, which was rapidly becoming worthless. Many Pennsylvania farmers, tired of having their crops seized by both armies, simply stopped producing surpluses. Some secretly sold their goods to the British in Philadelphia, who paid in gold and silver rather than worthless paper money. The quartermaster department, responsible for supplies, was incompetent and possibly corrupt. Officers in that department were accused of profiteering, buying supplies cheaply and selling them at inflated prices while soldiers starved. On December 23, 1777, Washington wrote to Henry Laurens describing conditions that seem almost unbelievable. He reported that no fewer than 2,898 men in camp were unfit for duty because they were barefoot and otherwise naked. Think about that number. Nearly a quarter of his entire army lacked basic clothing. Men stood guard duty in the snow without shoes, their feet wrapped in rags that froze solid. When they walked, they left bloody footprints. Some soldiers literally had no shirts or pants, just blankets wrapped around their bodies. The food situation was equally desperate. Army records show that in January 1778, each soldier received a daily ration of 1/2 pound of beef. By February, the meat rations disappeared entirely for days at a time. Men went without food. When food did arrive, it was often just flour and water mixed into a paste called fire cake, cooked over open fires. There were no vegetables, no salt to preserve or flavor food, insufficient grain. Soldiers searched the frozen woods for nuts and roots. Some ate bark. The cry that echoed through the camp became a bitter joke. No meat, no meat. Soldiers would chant it like a dirge, their frustration and hunger turning into dark humor. Disease became the greatest killer. Over the 6-month encampment at Valley Forge, approximately 2,000 soldiers died. Very few died from the cold itself or from starvation. Most died from disease. Typhus, typhoid fever, pneumonia, dysentery, and smallpox swept through the cramped huts. 12 men sleeping in a 14 by 16-foot cabin with inadequate ventilation, no sanitation, and weakened immune systems from malnutrition created perfect conditions for epidemic disease. The camp hospital couldn't handle the flood of sick men. Medical knowledge in 1778 was primitive. Doctors didn't understand germ theory. They had no antibiotics. Their treatments often made things worse. Bloodletting, purging, and blistering were standard treatments that weakened already sick men. The one medical success at Valley Forge was smallpox inoculation. Washington had ordered mass inoculation of his troops in January 1777. But when smallpox broke out again at Valley Forge, an investigation discovered that 3,000 to 4,000 troops with long-term enlistments had never been inoculated. Washington immediately ordered inoculations for all vulnerable soldiers. The procedure involved deliberately infecting soldiers with a mild form of smallpox to provide immunity. It was dangerous, with some men dying from the inoculation itself, but it was far safer than naturally acquired smallpox, which killed 15 to 33% of victims. By June 1778, the Continental Army had completed what historians call the first large-scale state-sponsored immunization campaign in history. While his soldiers suffered, Washington faced political attacks that threatened to destroy his command. Some members of Congress, and even some military officers, believed Washington was incompetent and should be replaced. The so-called Conway Cabal, named after Thomas Conway, a foreign Continental Army general and critic of Washington, represented the most organized threat to Washington's leadership. The conspirators wanted to replace Washington with Major General Horatio Gates, who had won the victory at Saratoga. Anonymous letters circulated attacking Washington's abilities. One letter from January 1778 sneered that the proper methods of attacking, beating, and conquering. The enemy had never yet been adopted by the commander-in-chief. The implication was clear. Washington was losing battles while Gates was winning them. The cabal fell apart through a series of leaks and embarrassing exposures. Letters revealed the conspiracy. Gates and Conway were humiliated. Washington's supporters rallied to his defense. The crisis actually strengthened Washington's position because it demonstrated that despite military setbacks, he retained the loyalty of most of his officers and the respect of Congress. Washington's steady leadership through this political crisis, combined with his decision to remain at Valley Forge suffering alongside his troops, cemented his authority beyond the immediate crisis of survival. Washington used the Valley Forge encampment to address fundamental problems with his army. The Continental Army was not really a unified force. It was a collection of state, militias, and regionally organized units with different training, different equipment, and different levels of discipline. Officers had been appointed through political connections rather than military competence. There was no standardized drill, no common manual of arms, no unified tactical doctrine. In battle, this lack of standardization created chaos. Units couldn't coordinate movements. They couldn't perform complex maneuvers. They were brave but disorganized amateurs facing the most professional army in the world. Washington knew that courage alone couldn't win the war. His army needed professional training. The answer arrived at Valley Forge on February 23, 1778, in the imposing figure of Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Steuben was a Prussian military officer who arrived in America with exaggerated credentials. Benjamin Franklin, writing from Paris, had inflated Steuben's resume, claiming he was a lieutenant general who had served Frederick the Great. The reality was more modest. Steuben had been a captain in the Prussian army, discharged in 1763 for unknown reasons. His title of baron came from a subsequent position as chamberlain to a minor German court. But while Steuben's rank had been exaggerated, his military expertise was genuine. Steuben didn't speak English, which should have been a crippling handicap. Instead, it became part of his legend. He would bark orders in German and French, which were then translated by Alexander Hamilton and other aides. When frustrated, he would swear profusely in multiple languages, and the soldiers loved him for it. Unlike many European officers who remained aloof from common soldiers, Steuben got into the mud and snow with his men, demonstrating every movement himself. He began by creating a model company of 100 hand-picked soldiers. Every day, he personally drilled these men, teaching them how to stand, how to march, how to turn, how to present arms. how to load and fire their muskets efficiently. The key was standardization and simplification. European armies had complex drill manuals with dozens of different movements. Steuben stripped away unnecessary complications and created a simplified system that amateur soldiers could learn quickly. He taught them to march in step, maintaining formation. He taught them to execute turns and wheeling movements that would allow large formations to maneuver on the battlefield. Most importantly, he taught them to load and fire their muskets with speed and precision. Before Steuben's training, Continental soldiers had no standard firing procedure. Some armies used 20 or more separate movements to load and fire. Steuben reduced it to essential steps that could be performed quickly under pressure. The model company, once trained, became instructors. Each soldier in the model company was assigned to train other soldiers. Those soldiers would train others. Within weeks, the entire army at Valley Forge was drilling every day, in the frozen mud, weak from hunger. Soldiers practiced their movements over and over until they became automatic. The physical training also had psychological benefits. It gave the men purpose and structure during a time when morale was at its lowest. It made them feel like real soldiers rather than a starving rabble. It restored their confidence. Steuben also revolutionized camp organization. Before his arrival, there had been no standard arrangement of huts, latrines, kitchens, or storage. Camps were filthy, contributing to disease. Steuben established strict standards for camp layout. Kitchens had to be on one side of camp, latrines on the opposite side, with latrines positioned downhill so waste wouldn't contaminate water supplies. He enforced basic hygiene, requiring regular cleaning of huts and proper disposal of waste. These reforms, combined with the inoculation program, helped reduce disease mortality. Steuben worked with Alexander Hamilton and Marquis de Lafayette to write everything down in a comprehensive training manual. The result was regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, commonly known as the Blue Book. This manual, officially adopted by Congress on March 29, 1779, remained the official United States military drill manual until 1812. Help finally arrived in the form of Nathaniel Greene, who accepted the position of quartermaster general in March 1778. Greene was one of Washington's most talented generals, and he was reluctant to leave field command for administrative work. But he recognized the supply crisis was existential. Greene energetically reorganized the quartermaster department, eliminating corruption, establishing accountability, and creating functioning supply lines. He sent foraging parties into the countryside to purchase or seize food and supplies. Under his leadership, conditions at Valley Forge gradually improved. The flow of supplies remained irregular, but the army was no longer on the brink of starvation. Washington also had to maintain constant military pressure on the British in Philadelphia. Despite his army's weakened condition, he established a network of outposts and patrols that ringed the city from Wilmington, Delaware to Trenton, New Jersey. Small mobile units of Continental soldiers and Pennsylvania. Militia harassed British foraging parties, ambushed supply convoys, and made the roads around Philadelphia dangerous. These patrols had frequent contact with loyalist militias and British regulars, and died in small skirmishes that never made it into history books. But this constant low-level warfare prevented the British from freely plundering the Pennsylvania countryside and kept Washington's army combat-ready even during winter quarters. The arrival of spring brought hope. News reached Valley Forge in May 1778 that France had formally recognized American independence and signed a military alliance. France's entry into the war transformed everything. Britain would now face not just American rebels, but the French Navy, French money, and potentially French troops. The soldiers at Valley Forge celebrated wildly when they learned France was now their ally. But there was one more test. On June 18, 1778, Washington received intelligence that the British were evacuating Philadelphia. A new British commander, General Henry Clinton, had replaced Howe. Clinton had orders to consolidate. British forces in New York because the war was expanding to other theaters. The British Army, along with thousands of loyalist civilians, began a march across New Jersey toward New York. Washington saw his opportunity. After 6 months of suffering, his army was finally ready to fight. On June 19, 1778, the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge. They were transformed. These were not the ragged, starving men who had arrived in December. They moved in precise formations. They marched in step. Their muskets were shouldered at the same angle. They looked like a real army. 10 days later, they caught up with the British at Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey. The Battle of Monmouth, fought in brutal summer heat on June 28th, would prove whether Steuben's training had worked. The battle began with an American advance under General Charles Lee, who promptly ordered a confused retreat when he encountered stronger British forces than expected. Washington arrived to find his advance guard falling back in disorder. In a rare display of fury, Washington relieved Lee on the spot and personally rallied the troops. The battle that followed was a confused, brutal slugfest in 100-degree heat. Men on both sides collapsed from heat stroke. The fighting went on for hours. But the Continental Army, despite the initial setback, performed magnificently. They held their ground against British bayonet charges. They executed complex maneuvers under fire. They withdrew in good order and reformed their lines. The battle ended essentially in a draw, with both sides claiming victory. But the true significance was that the Continental Army had stood toe-to-toe with British regulars and fought them to a standstill. The Steuben trained soldiers had performed complex battlefield maneuvers that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. British officers who had dismissed the Continentals as undisciplined. Rabble now faced an enemy that could match them in drill and discipline. Monmouth proved that Valley Forge had transformed the Continental Army into a force capable of winning the war. The myth of Valley Forge has sometimes overshadowed the reality. Later artists and writers created romantic images of Washington praying in the snow, of noble suffering, of patriots enduring hardship for freedom. These images contain truth, but they miss the desperate, brutal reality. Men died from diseases that turned their bowels to liquid. They froze in inadequate shelters. They went mad from hunger. They deserted by the hundreds. What prevented mass desertion or mutiny was a combination of factors. Washington's leadership was crucial. By remaining at Valley Forge, by sharing the hardships even though he had the right to leave, he earned absolute loyalty from his officers and men. His correspondence with Congress and state governors, begging for supplies, showed he was fighting for them. His willingness to defend his officers against political attacks, and his refusal to become involved in political conspiracies, demonstrated integrity. Many soldiers stayed because they literally had nowhere else to go. Deserters faced execution if caught. They would return home to farms devastated by war, with no money and no prospects. Some stayed because they believed in the cause, though that belief was tested to the breaking point by suffering. The support of women at Valley Forge is often overlooked, but was essential. Approximately 400 women were present at the camp, including officers' wives like Martha Washington, who arrived in February and stayed until June, and the wives and families of enlisted men. These women weren't just camp followers. They served as nurses, tending the sick in hospitals where they risked contracting deadly diseases. They washed and mended clothes. Crucial work when clothing shortages meant a repaired coat could keep a man alive. They cooked meals and baked bread when supplies were available. They maintained morale through their presence. Martha Washington, despite being the wife of the commander-in-chief, worked alongside other women in the hospital tents, demonstrating that shared sacrifice crossed class lines. Some of these women had followed the army for years, enduring every hardship alongside the soldiers. Their contribution to the army's survival deserves recognition. The transformation of the Continental Army at Valley Forge wasn't just about military drill and battlefield tactics. It was about creating a sense of shared identity and purpose. Men who had arrived thinking of themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians began to think of themselves as Americans. They had suffered together, trained together, and survived together. The bonds forged at Valley Forge created unit, cohesion that would sustain the army through 4 more years of war. Valley Forge was not the coldest or most deadly winter the Continental Army endured. The winter of 1779 to 1780 at Morristown, New Jersey was actually worse in terms of weather and hardship. But Valley Forge became the symbol of revolutionary suffering because it represented a turning point. The army that went into Valley Forge was a defeated, disorganized collection of state militias. The army that emerged was a disciplined, confident force capable of defeating the British. The political crisis surrounding Washington's command was resolved. The supply system, while never perfect, was functioning. The training program created by Steuben gave the army tactical professionalism. The French alliance provided diplomatic recognition, financial support, and military assistance. All of these factors converged at Valley Forge to save the Continental Army from destruction and set the stage for eventual victory. When George Washington resigned his commission as commander-in-chief in 1783, after the Treaty of Paris ended the war, he wrote to Baron von Steuben thanking him for his faithful and meritorious service. That simple letter acknowledged what Steuben's work at Valley Forge had meant. Without his training, the Continental Army might never have become capable of winning decisive battles. The 6 months at Valley Forge, from December 1777 to June 1778, represent one of the most remarkable stories of perseverance in military history. An army that should have disintegrated, that had every reason to quit, that was abandoned by its own government and left to starve, somehow survived and emerged stronger. They survived because of Washington's leadership, because of Steuben's training, because of Greene's organizational skills, because of the determination of common soldiers who endured unimaginable hardship, and because they believed, even in their darkest moments, that what they were fighting for mattered. Valley Forge proved that the American Revolution would not be won through quick, easy victories. It would be won through the stubborn refusal to quit. The British controlled the major cities. They had a professional army and the world's most powerful navy. But they couldn't break the will of men who had survived Valley Forge. When you visit Valley Forge today, it's a peaceful national park with reconstructed huts and monuments. It's hard to imagine the frozen hell it was in 1778. But if you stand there in winter, when the wind cuts across those open fields and the temperature drops below freezing, you might begin to understand what those men endured. They were cold, hungry, sick, and abandoned. They watched their comrades die from disease. They questioned whether their sacrifice meant anything, but they stayed. They drilled in the snow. They built their army, and they won their independence. That is the true legacy of Valley Forge.